Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and today is episode 62, reflecting on FIDO's evolution to passkeys with FIDO enthusiasts Yuri Ackerman and Yari Takala. So welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, good. Great to be here.
And why don't we start with some quick intros? Yuri, I'm just going to call you Ackerman because Yari and Yuri sound kind of similar. So we'll go with Ackerman. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up in FIDO and what you're doing.
So I'm Yuri Ackerman. I'm, I guess, FIDO enthusiast, as you would call it. I work these days as independent consultant. I help companies to develop and deploy FIDO solutions on various fronts, be it enterprise or consumer-focused stuff. I'm based in New Zealand, and I got into FIDO all the way in 2015. So I've been doing FIDO for a long time, and for 8 years I've led FIDO Alliance's technical certification. So I'm pretty well versed into FIDO protocols, and I write blogs sometimes. So follow me there.
And Yari, tell us a little bit about how you got here.
Sure. So I'd call myself more of an infrastructure engineer, working on systems and networks, but security and privacy and identity really interrelate with these. And especially if you're building out a platform, whether it's a large scale, growth company like Facebook where I used to work or anything like that, identity and authentication are very important. And so it was while working at Facebook that I worked a lot on PIV and YubiKeys and kind of SSH access, and eventually this led me down to exploring FIDO2 as a way of providing phishing-resistant authentication for employees, and that led me to being involved in the FIDO Alliance through the working groups, and eventually becoming board representative of Meta on the FIDO Alliance, and I did that until mid 2023 when I left Facebook or Meta as it's now known, and I went straight into consulting for the Singapore government on identity. So Singapore has a really great digital identity system. A little bit of consulting there.
I'm always telling people how SingPass is really well done, and I've been advocating that other governments should look at Singapore, because I think if you look at the ROI on a citizen identity system, I bet you Singapore is the highest one.
Absolutely,
so they've just done a really good job.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Singapore's done a phenomenal job there, and I think they're probably the leader in that space. So I was really, honored to have been able to consult and advise on that. And now I'm back at, working more on the network side of infrastructure, so nothing really related to identity today, but I'm happy to be here and kind of talk through this transition as we watched passkeys evolve over the last couple of years, especially as I was part of that.
Yeah. So this, Yuri, you wrote this blog a couple of months ago. I immediately said, let's have a discussion about it on the live stream. 10 weeks later, we're actually doing that. And the blog for the audience is listed on the homework, as you'd expect. It's the only thing assigned for homework for this episode. But let's just walk through that a little bit. And Yuri, maybe you could describe what were passkeys like before 22? What were some of the goals for passkeys that sort of drove the design pre 2022?
So FIDO, as its origin started in 2014, had a very clear goal into how it wanted to see the ecosystem, right? The governing basically laws for the FIDO was at this time is basically the privacy, security, and user experience, right? One of the foundations of the security is specifically the keys have to be stored in hardware-backed cryptographic storages, right? So until 2022, it was basically illegal almost by FIDO standards to have synchronizable keys. All of the keys had to be device bound, and so we see this is in form of the implementation of the security keys like YubiKeys, as well as what we called back then platform authenticators, which were basically built-in authenticators into operating systems like iOS. Apple had their own implementation, Google had their own, and Microsoft had their own. So basically, that means that you could create a key, a FIDO credential, what we call passkey today, and it will be stored on the device bound, and never could be exported. There will be have a very strong protection mechanisms, very strong assurance mechanisms, so that relying party would know that what is the exact security level of those keys. So that was kind of like a governing view of that until basically May 2022. Since
So
then,
let's break there before we go into this since then, because I had a quick question for Yari. So Yari, when you were evaluating, let's call them, I want to call them passkeys, but maybe they were FIDO tokens at the time. You know, there were these properties of security, MFA, and phishing resistance. And did you see those as sort of key, or what went into your decision to select FIDO as a technology when you were working in the enterprise space, workforce space?
So we had, you know, PIV modules, things like security keys such as YubiKeys support PIV, which is like a US government
or
standard.
like these, God forbid.
Exactly. And the thing is, the support in some ways is quite broad, but it often requires kind of middleware or third-party libraries, and you know it's a bit clunky. It's not easy, right? It's not geared towards the average employee or consumer, even, you know, using a web browser and doing authentication, or a smartphone user, right? And we definitely explored the use of PIV, and we definitely even bootstrapped some of our authentication with PIV on YubiKeys. But I wish I had looked at FIDO earlier, actually. I remember I started exploring about 2021, and my only regret was like, why didn't I look at this earlier? Because
it's fascinating, because you had the form factor of the key, and you're like, oh, and we can put a PIV certificate on this. That's great. So it's almost like backwards. I would think you'd go from, oh, it's a FIDO credential, and we could also put a PIV key on it, rather than, oh, it's a PIV key holder, and we could do FIDO. I've never heard of that direction for this device, but maybe it makes sense. And you know,
so it was tricky. Sorry.
I was going to say,
was tricky.
I also remember, you know, there's a subtlety in here about MFA, where pre 2022 and before, I always thought of this as a two-factor authentication device. This is something that I have, and I combine it with something that I know I have MFA. So it almost seemed axiomatic that FIDO would be MFA. Why else would you be doing this? So I'm sure, didn't Meta or Facebook also have a requirement for MFA? Wasn't that part of the point? Was that it was MFA?
Absolutely. Yeah, and another thing was user presence, the concept that somebody's physically tapping or touching this. So, you know, you had these multiple factors, and then the notion that like sometimes you want to assert user presence, or you might even in FIDO there's like, you know, you could tap a security key, physically tap it. There's also another notion, is user verification, which actually requires a PIN as well. And yeah, all of these were requirements, and led us to really adopting security keys initially, and actually banning the use of platform authenticators for our use case, because we lacked attestation platform authenticators. So, and then actually, maybe elaborate on that. Apple on platform authenticators on Mac OS devices, for example, I think for privacy reasons, I believe they lacked like a secure attestation chain. If I'm not making something up, I think this was around 2021, 2022. Chrome would give you kind of like a attestation cert, but you wouldn't really get it from the device itself.
Interesting.
Yuri, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but this is what my notes say.
So until basically September 2022, Apple did support actually full attestation. So basically, both Apple and Google and Microsoft and iOS had attestations. However, I think the issue you're referring to is at the beginning, Google. So basically, like platform authenticators underneath everyone. It's underlying on the platform level. Not all browsers are supposed to connect to it. Like that's the way it works right now, for example. But in early stages, Google Chrome did not have connection to a platform authenticator, so they would issue their own credentials that would be not attested.
Yeah.
But Safari and other in iOS browsers, on iOS mobile and Safari mobile and Safari desktop, they did have this. However, that created this kind of like a pain situation where you didn't have attestation on one browser and you had attestation different browser. Those credentials were not in the same space. So yeah, on macOS there was definitely a bit of a problem.
Yeah, that sounds like it. That was definitely the issue we ran into, and that's where it was driving us to just using security keys initially, at least, and not using platform authenticators.
Right. And so in this range, you said, and Yuri Ackerman had put together this interesting chart that shows how security keys have now become all of enterprise, but there was a little bit of overlap where you could potentially use platform authenticators for enterprise, because these were device-bound platform authenticators. But I don't know, Yuri, did people actually do that? Did you see any enterprise deployment of platform authenticators?
Yes, we've seen actually multiple cases where they were deployed. There were always a bit of a friction because, as you said, they were kind of like Apple as well came with the support of the platform quite late. I think we're talking about 2021, actually, beginning of 2021. So they only actually had support for platform credentials for a very short span of time. But yeah, we definitely have seen there was a couple of projects that I was working on in the UK with my partners. Some banks were starting to deploy them. There was a very massive project in Nordics in actually enabling platform authenticators for an entire countries. So yeah, that thing was definitely moving pretty fast.
And when you think about it, the platform authenticators would mean like there's a token built into your computer almost, where if you
Yes.
have a Mac and you have an iPad, your token would be specific for your Mac. If you went to your iPad, you would have to actually re-enroll that as almost like a different token.
Yes. So you're basically it would replicate a security key functionality, but for the device. So your device becomes the authenticator.
I always thought this was okay because I was like, it's fine. The idea is that people have multiple keys and they have multiple devices, and they always make sure that they don't lose access to one of those. So yeah, I might lose my MacBook, but that's why I want to have maybe a YubiKey or another device registered so that even if I lose this device, I have another device that I can re-enroll. But you know what?
I think
It
that
turns
there's
out,
the issue there. Like
yeah,
it's
go
the
on,
enrollment
Dari.
ceremony.
Yeah.
It's that people are used to just creating one password when they log into an account or service. They log in with that one password everywhere. Now you're talking about, well, you got to enroll multiple devices. You have to go through a ceremony, and then you have to go through the revocation ceremony potentially if someone loses a device, which probably may not even happen, right? People just leave it attached to their account.
Right, that's true.
So this is one of the issues I think that comes up with this.
Yeah,
and
this is where it's going to go. Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely a clear point, because even back then when we were discussing with the clients, for example, how do you enable user to add a secondary device, right? There was a lot of discussion on like, would you just do a kind of like a QR code that you would redirect them that way, and you would do like pre-authorization one device for you add the other one. Do we like back then FIDO just started to enable the hybrid flow, so would that work? There was definitely a lot of challenges for the users and relying parties in enabling management of a lot of those operations that would require a lot of out-of-band flows as well as out-of-band authorization. So yes, that definitely had a complexities that led Alliance to change its way of thinking.
Yeah. So if I'm using an Apple Watch and I unbox my Apple Watch and I try and log into that website, I'm sort of expecting all my credentials to be there. Like when I boot up a new Chrome browser, I expect my passwords to be saved so I can get into my website. If I have to re-enroll at every single website on my watch, the UX is terrible. Plus, if you're Apple and you just want to keep selling people more and more types of devices, the more you can do reduce friction so that they can use their devices, the more devices people are going to buy. Um, but you actually bring up another point about account recovery. That's probably like really the killer in this whole thing. So can you talk a little bit about why account recovery became a driver and what was that all about? Like why was account recovery so important?
So, I mean, account recovery is just pointing out, account recovery is one of the things that being discussed within the Passkey ecosystem, between the FIDO ecosystem, as specifically what the new multi-device synchronizable passkeys enable, simplified account recovery. However, if we're talking about like before we move to the synchronized passkeys, that's
Yeah,
definitely a big issue, right? Because your system as secure as the weakest part of that system. So if you force everybody to use device-bound keys and you don't have a robust account recovery, that becomes a problem. Now, in enterprise setting, it's pretty easy, right? You lost a security key. You walk into the office, you say, "Hi, Mike, can I have another one?" And you get another one. There is face-to-face verification. It's kind of seamless. However, with the situation with the COVID and everybody working from home, as well as looking at the consumer cases, there is clearly an issue with lack of with amount of work needs to be done for the account recovery for the specifically the device bound credentials like security keys, like previous platform credentials. So
so
account
let's
recovery
go to
is, yeah.
2023. So the synchronizing the keys is the big solution. Walk us through that. Like what happens?
So the change was quite simple. Instead of storing the keys in the hardware-based stores, they would be stored in synchronized stores, right? Apple just uses their existing iCloud keychain infrastructure. Google just moved to using their Google Password Managers, and then you have things like Dashlane and 1Password and LastPass, etc. So it's very, very simple idea of taking a private key and synchronizing it. And we already had an existing solutions for doing this for passwords. The whole even term, like just for those who don't know, passkey, it's kind of derivative of password, right? And so it's very the whole philosophy of it, like when people a lot of the time being upset that it does one things and not does the other things. You also the entire philosophy is very straightforward. Passkey is supposed to do everything that passwords do, but being phishing resistant method for authentication, right? So synchronize between devices, sharing of the passkeys, all of these things, as much as they have other issues coming out of it. That was the philosophy behind this. The cool thing about passkeys is that they are basically what we call lowering the pressure on recovery systems, because if you lose your device and you have your other device, you're still able to ultimately authenticate because the passkey is
Yeah.
synchronized between devices. So it doesn't solve account recovery, but it lowers the pressure for it and means that consumer-facing services have much easier life when dealing with customers who have multiple devices. So yeah.
So Yari, when this transition happened, what was your thought of the impact with your enterprise sort of architect hat on? How did this, we're now syncing, we used to have these things that we knew were bound to devices. Now they're not, they're syncable across devices. Did that change your calculus at all about their usefulness as an enterprise authentication technology?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of concerns and a lot of risks and trade-offs and benefits to navigate. Well, what happens if somebody adds an iPad to their Apple account that's not a company issued one or something like that. And and now the threat model needs to encompass these platform providers such as Microsoft and Apple and Google, because if you could find a way to recover someone's account and get their iCloud keychain synced to a new device as an attacker, you could potentially get these credentials synchronized to this additional device, right? So it really kind of moved upstream. It's not like that we like account recovery, which like Yuri had alluded to in the enterprise. You just go and you talk to some people in the company, recognize each other, and they kind of help you reset your account. But like the threat model now includes that platform providers' security and account recovery procedures, because if somebody could reset my enterprise iCloud account, they could recover my credentials potentially.
Right, and also
there's
it goes
ways to
from
mitigate some of
MFA
this.
to you might lose some of the MFA properties, right? So if you're using a security key, I guess you're still fine, because that's still a key bound. The key is still in the key and it doesn't get exported or synced. But if you're using a platform, what we were in the old days calling a platform authenticator, which was tied to your device, now that that's synced, it's not MFA anymore. And so if you were using these for MFA, you're now not.
Another kind of factor that we found that helps on this is the use of client certificates. So if your enterprise, your intranet or internal SSO or enterprise applications require client certificates in your browser, that can be managed through like MDM or DEP or whatever. And that way you can make sure that these devices have client certificates. So even if someone gets your credential, they'd also need to get that client certificate, right? Which does raise the bar. And I guess that's how we were able to get on board with passkeys, really, was that like client certificates enabling authentication at the transport layer.
And just to add one more thing, the classical device-bound platform credentials are still available via the MDM on Apple, and Google are still in kind of a process of deprecating them on user side and moving them to enterprise thing. So for controlled enterprise environments where you control the entire infrastructure, you still kind of have those things, but that is kind of difficult because you have to, like, lots of companies, for example, don't want to use MDM, right? They just want to use BYO policies, and so it's kind of like at that moment, if you're moving to that types of deployment, you might as well just give everybody a YubiKey.
And Yuri, can you talk a little bit about the user experience here? So what I found has been tricky in this transition is that I test a lot of tokens, right? I'm always getting new tokens or trying new things. And so sometimes I find that it's almost like the passkey experience gets prioritized by default. And it's almost like for me sometimes to find these other flows or use these other types of authenticators is challenging. What happened, or maybe you can shed some light on, are other flows deprecated, or is the UX just not optimized? What was the impact for enterprise users of prioritizing this passkey platform authenticator flow?
There are definitely discrepancies in quality of user experience. That's I wouldn't even call it between different kind of scenarios, security keys versus synchronized passkeys. I think there is a bigger discussion about even between platforms, right? How Apple reacts on things versus how Google reacts on things. The experience in quite funny in Chrome on macOS versus Safari, even though they technically both use the same platform authenticator, the overlaying interface that Google adds, there are definitely a friction between those experiences.
Yeah,
However,
I've noticed that myself as a Mac user, that there is a difference between Safari and Chrome. And yeah, and I have a joke where I say I want to go to apple.com on Chrome and I want to go to google.com and on Safari and see the experience be the same. And it's we're totally not there yet right now. Is my
Yeah.
impression.
That's, however, is manageable. I mean, this is actually where some of the friction in when we talk about the passkey deployments are challenging, because the amount of knowledge that you need to have for these deployments is quite a mess. From all the engineering, all the basic engineering, updating your identity pipeline, to compliance, to how do you manage the user experience. It's quite a lot. It's not impossible. I mean, but there are quite a few UX and UI options that you have to set up in WebAuth and request to tailor experience to exactly what you want. Additionally, you have to basically keep a track of what platform you're on, what authenticator you get, etc. So these things are improving. This is definitely a working thing, and my colleagues who Tim Capelli and Matthew Miller and other ones, they work quite a lot on to kind of like bringing those experiences into more streamlined way and providing a tooling thing. So I think overall, actually, user experience is something I would actually applaud all the changes that happened in the last 2 years. One of the most amazing things that happened is enablement of WebAuth and autofill. So that when you click on the user field and you can select username, or you can just select a passkey. When you click it and you right away logged in. That is an outstanding. It has a really great experience with the users. Users love this thing, and it streamlines the whole authentication process to be very, very simple. For security keys, I think there is a bit of a definite bias against security keys experiences. It's always being left on secondary. I mean, a lot of the logic kind of makes sense. I mean, if you're going to be using security keys, you're already kind of in more enterprise environments, so users are prepared for additional friction. I guess that's their sense. And for someone like Apple and Google, their priority is not support for the enterprise. Their priority is support for the consumer-facing experiences, because that's who the market is, right? So there are some things that needs to be discussed within the ecosystem. However, I think that mostly the ecosystem needs more guidance, more and better technical guidance on how to implement those experiences and tailor the existing API. So, and I think there's work already being done on that front.
Yuri, I'm curious, you were sort of working with the FIDO Alliance in this pivotal time when they were making this transition from really strategy A, which started maybe in 2012 or 13, quite early on, maybe 14. And then they made this big pivot in 2022 to passkeys. I'm just curious, what was some of the justifications that you were hearing for this pivot? And what did you think as somebody who maybe just got whiplashed a little bit because you got in, you started learning in strategy A, and then all of a sudden there was moving to strategy B? I'm just curious if you can think back or remember what were some of your thoughts at the time.
Sure. I mean, I remember there was a lot of wrangling around nomenclature, names. What do we mean when we say a passkey versus a device-bound key, or a roaming authenticator, as security keys are also known as, and there was like a lot of kind of wrangling and trying to figure out like the language and what are we trying to do here, and I think ultimately what won out is that what gives us the biggest security benefit, the greatest benefit in terms of phishing resistance for consumers, or for the largest number of people, and that is passkeys, right? Like I think this made my job as someone working on enterprise deployment a lot harder, but like I can't you can't dispute that it was the right thing to do. Like I completely I think I was very supportive of like what was going on there, not this evolution, but it was a time where like we didn't really have the language. When there's some new technology that's being created, you don't really have the language, or you haven't really figured out like the common way of communicating around it and wrapping your mind around a new security model that like includes now in your threat model now includes a platform provider, a platform vendor, right? And but I think this was about making it better for consumers and impacting hundreds of millions, if not billions of people, really, versus a much smaller subset if we were to continue down the old trodden path.
Yeah, and Yuri, it's almost like post 2022, we have a clear bucket where if you're in the consumer space, you're looking at synced passkeys, and if you're in the enterprise space, you now better be looking at probably security keys, about physical keys. Do you think that that's right? And do you think that we're missing anything here?
I think first of all is kind of like quantification of the value of the passkeys versus security keys is one of the things that you kind of like, more needs to be discussed about. I mean, right after that blog, I published another one called "Are Passkeys MFA?" or "Does it even matter?" And this came from a discussion that was happening on Twitter about that Amazon, for example, steps up passkeys with additional factor. Now, it is really funny to have a phishing resistant factor stepped up by an OTP. So, irony is not lost in that. However, I think like this is where we need to a bit of a step back and understand that the existing existing factor model, something
so many of those I have to admit are so dumb. I did in my state of Texas driver's license, I had to renew it, had to reset my password. So I reset my password and I logged in, and then they said, "Oh, we don't recognize this browser. We're going to send you an email." I'm like, this is crazy. Like, what did you just do? I can reset my control emails. All I need for resetting.
Yeah.
So the idea that you get stepped up, I understand where they're coming from now, and I think this makes more sense. I don't know about for Amazon, but certainly in Europe, they're of the consensus that passkeys are only one factor. It's control of your account. And so I would expect, it's so ironic, though, that you're going to get stepped up with a phishable credential. We spent all this effort making these strong, unphishable credentials, and you're going to get stepped up with a phishable credential. It just doesn't, like, our system doesn't make any sense.
And so this is where I was talking about is the existing approach of the factors in general, as for example, Dean Sachs and sorry, I forgot. They were talking at Authenticate about Pamela. So Dean Sachs and Pam
Pamela.
from Pamela Dinge. They were talking about that we need to start moving away from the factors to the signals, right? Because, for example, under the factor model, right, the like for example, password is the same as passkey, is one factor. However, they are on different universes in terms of levels of security. And SMS, which is considered to be a device possession factor, is on different universe from a security key. So the existing factors not fully describe, the existing factor model not fully describe the actual security needs of the enterprises. So that is where, and however, in the same time, passkeys, with all their benefits and their phishing resistance, which is, I don't think people understand just how much it's important to build up phishing resistant authentication. I think there are a lot of limitations of them deploying for actual good reasons. Like there's a good reason why passkeys are not considered to be multi-factor under the PSD2, PSD3. So banks cannot use them to authenticate users. And banks have a lot of other ways to make sure that users logged in fairly securely, right? But in the same time, as I said, like when you start moving away from MFA model, because there's a lot of places where passkeys would work, but those regulations would not allow this to happen. So we have too many straight lines, and we need to start thinking about this as a specter of security that passkeys provide. Like a great example where passkeys would actually completely would work fantastically, and it's already shown it works, is airlines. Air New Zealand, I've talked to their representative on Authenticate, and I've looked at their journey for quite some time. they show passkeys are fantastic, right? It gives you enough security, right, and it gives you a fantastic user experience all at the same time. So you have good security, good user experience, fast authentication, and enough PI protection, right? But for bank authentication, that's not enough, right? If you have $100,000 on your account, you're genuinely a valuable enough threat for somebody to come in after your core platform accounts, after your iOS and Google account, right? However, at the same time, passkeys are really good for transaction security. So there needs to be a better discussion in terms of what are we achieving with authentication, and make sure that people understand where passkey is genuinely working, and build up a framework for discussion with regulators to explain to them where that some cases where PSD2 does not allow basically passkeys right now are justifiable to use passkeys. So there is sides of like, we need to improve passkeys, add them device-bound signaling, as well as we need to ensure that regulators understand that passkey is still better for a lot of use cases than existing authentication systems.
So where are we now? If I'm a company, is there enough benefit in moving to passkeys and FIDO to get me to deploy it? If I need to deploy, OTP anyway, so I'm sort of wondering, like, where do you think we are now for consumer authentication and enterprise authentication separately?
So I think enterprise is something that Yari can talk about. He has better knowledge of this. In terms of consumer, I think that there is, and we really need to start now. Because one of the things that most rolling parties don't understand is that it takes time from enabling passkeys to moving to passkeys, right? This is where the biggest, I think, misunderstanding of it's not like user added passkey and you have right away phishing resistance, because you still have passwords. And I don't discourage services. I most of the times when I talk to consumer services, I say put passkeys first and foremost as user experience thing, right?
Mm-hmm. Teach
your customers how to use passkeys, right? Let them use it. Now, within a year, you're going to collect enough of data of customer usage. And if the customers, and you see if within the year user haven't used passwords basically at all, provide them, ask them, do you want to just disable passwords? When that happens, you have a phishing resistant user. So that is an ultimate goal. However, for this to happen, it is time investment, it is resource investment, it is campaigning. You as well need to have a quality and robust recovery system. This is what most of the services kind of like to forget, is that passkeys don't solve recovery. They lower the pressure for this. And if you deploy passkeys, you're going to spend less on account recovery in general. But when everything goes wrong, user still needs to have an effective way to come back to their account. So I would encourage anyone today to start working on their deployment, because with the rise of phishing, with the rise of spear phishing, with the nuclear level threat from the AI powered spear phishing, we really need to start moving to phishing resistant methods today. Well, better yesterday, but today is the second best time to start to do that. And this journey will take time. It's not something that happens in a day. So Rome wasn't built in a day, so passkeys are not deployed in a day either.
Yeah. So Yari, let's talk a little bit about the enterprises.
Mm-hmm.
If you're advising a new enterprise, would you advocate for passkeys? Would you advocate for security keys?
Yeah.
Would you say we got burned, or this whole strategy changed once? Is it going to change again?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure. Where would you be on that spectrum?
Well, I think my answer here also relates to the consumer side. And one thing I think is just software engineers getting more experience with this, better frameworks and libraries coming out that make it easier to integrate and to deploy passkeys. So we're starting to see more of that. And you go on GitHub, you find these libraries and frameworks, and it makes it a little easier, right? People have paved the way and made it easier to set up your passkey, your databases and all the API calls and everything that you need to do to get set up. And another thing to touch on is the NIST's update to SP, say 863B, that says that passkeys are multi-factor authenticators. Like, so there's like this
They don't say
catching
that.
They didn't say that. Okay, well,
Yeah, they said they're
maybe you can
they're,
clarify
they're
that.
good. They're good enough for AL2. So
Right.
that just means that they are sufficient enough to cover that. But there is a lot more nuances, yes. But they didn't say it's more.
Yeah, to get to the higher assurance. The other, and that goes beyond the authenticator. It also goes into the identity proofing too. But yeah,
but
going
I
back.
think
Sorry, we
broadly
digress.
the update there, is updating to passkeys and like the latest developments in the industry, and that's really important update that's like recently come out. And so now on enterprise adoption, I think it's like I would start off from like looking at this from day one today. Like if I were rolling this out in enterprise, or if they're an enterprise with like HOTP, for example, or some other methods, I'd be definitely looking to jump to this and skipping over potentially skipping over security keys. Like I think they're I think the needs always depend on the enterprise and the business context, but and as I said, like there's other factors that you have in enterprise, like client certificates that consumers wouldn't have, right? Which really increases the assurance that you're dealing with someone who's like working on a managed device. But of course, it's harder on BYOD environments and stuff like that. But
yeah,
I definitely do be looking at pushing it out.
And just pointing out, just to add to that, I mean first of all is that Google, in their own research in 2016, they moved their entire employee base. So every contractor, every employee, everyone who works in any way closely to that, they all get 2 of the YubiKeys. Okay, they shown that itself already covered the cost. So the lack of need of constant technical support for account recovery, stuff like this, already got them already paid back. Okay, in 2-year span. This was in 2016. Anyone who is deploying it today, the $50 or $100 you're going to spend per employee is a pennies to what you're going to get for that. And for example, solutions like YubiKeys, they support both PIF, they support FIDO, so you can deploy them both. There are alternatives for large-scale deployments. There are cards with support for FIDO and PIF, but it's not that much money for amount of benefit you're going to get. You're literally closing the front door for any potential attackers, any delays. You're lowering the need for recovery, and you're going to get a better user experience. I mean, I don't understand, unless you're from really poor countries, which I don't deny they're existing and they definitely have challenges. If you're US-based or European-based company, you should just go and buy a YubiKey or other alternative FIDO key. It just makes sense in today's world.
Well, let's go to last thoughts. That was a pretty good last thoughts. I'm going to give Yari the first last thoughts, and maybe we'll go back to you one last time, Yari. But Yari, any last thoughts before we close?
I think you already summarized it very well there. This investment is really worth it for enterprises, especially, but all kinds of relying parties, and I'm excited with what's coming. I think in the next several years, this is going to become maybe the primary way, I hope, that we authenticate to websites, to our our work, and hopefully maybe 3 to 5 years from now, we can look back and be like, wow, like we used to use passwords, we don't use them anymore.
Yeah, I remember the question I wanted to throw at you, Yari. I'm going to throw this one at you real quick. Do you think that maybe some companies might confuse passkeys with social login? So it's a platform authenticator backed up by Apple or Google, and its control of my Apple or Google account is sort of what we're talking about here. Do you think that there's any confusion among enterprises about, is this just am I just accepting social login because I've delegated the account recovery and the account management off to like Google or Apple?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a risk. I haven't heard of that particular view, before, but I think that's definitely there's a risk there, but you know, when we see like leading edge businesses adopting passkeys, I think the rest will follow. So, you know, I'm less concerned about that risk. But you know, something I think just through better awareness, I think it'll go away.
Yeah. And, you know, you can hear in my voice how email authentication, I think, is my pet peeve, because I always see email as
Yeah.
like one of the main attack surface areas for hackers is to get
Mhm.
at, you know, and then you're hanging it's like the worst authenticator ever. And we seem to be hanging more and more off email on the justification that it's MFA somehow. Control email is MFA. Um, so Yuri, I'll give you last thoughts. We're a little over, but you know you have tons of great insights here. And any other last thoughts before we call it?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, I think we need to start thinking more seriously about phishing. FIDO talked about it for the last 10 years. But today, with the rise of the AI, with the rise of the deepfakes and stuff like this, you know, with the quality of the phishing attacks, with the quality of spear phishing attacks, you have to start deploy passkeys yesterday. The second best day to do it is today. They are much better user experience wise from consumer perspective. They are much more secure and much easier to manage from enterprise perspective, and they generally come in featureful set. I would as well. One thing is, like, from my experience is, I would say take a lot more deliberation in terms of build versus buy, because sometimes the pathway to success might be shorter with buying than building. It's not as easy as it sounds. That's the way I would describe it. But it's absolutely essential for today's modern security. And the same way we started to move to TLS 5 years ago, we just start to move to passkeys today.
Awesome. Okay, well, do a quick announcement about the next episode. Heather Vesant and Eric Leach. Heather is a filmmaker and identity guru and leader in the identity industry. And Eric has been in this business longer than anybody, I believe. He worked at Oblix, which is a startup from like the 90s. So he's had a longer perspective practically than any other engineer or product manager. So please join us next time. Thank you guys for joining us. This was a great discussion. I had 5 more questions, but refer people to the article and to follow Yuri Ackerman on Medium for some more great thoughts on the industry. So thank you guys. Thank you, audience. We'll see you.